Coming up on Primetime Politics Weekend, a heated House.
Canadians can't afford a bigger bite off their paychecks. Will the Prime Minister cancel his tax hikes on Canadian paychecks?
Pierre Poilievre faces off against the Prime Minister for the first time as leader of the opposition. What tone does the first encounter set for the session ahead? Our weekend journalists are here with their thoughts. Also,
I really would like to believe the Conservatives share our sincere desire to help Canadians. Join us with this measure.
Canadians under pressure. The federal government moves ahead with measures meant to make life more affordable, but the opposition says the Liberal plan is way off base. We'll get some reaction from an anti-poverty activist working on the front lines. And it's been nearly 4 years since the federal government legalized cannabis, so as the government begins a review on the impact of that change, we'll take a look at the public health and other challenges legalization created. This is Primetime Politics Weekend. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Welcome to Primetime Politics Weekend. Raucous, heated, tense, just some of the words political watchers used ahead of Thursday's question period, the first opportunity for the Prime Minister to face off with the new leader of the official opposition. Pierre Poilievre made his debut Tuesday, but it wasn't until Thursday when the Prime Minister returned to the House. And when he did, here's a bit of what happened.
The leader of the Liberal Party has an opportunity to respect the fact that heating your home in January and February in Canada is not a luxury. And it does not make those Canadians polluters. They're just trying to survive. This from a Prime Minister who burned more jet fuel in 1 month than 20 average Canadians burn in an entire year. So will the Prime Minister ground the jet, park the hypocrisy, and axe the tax hikes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we're going to continue to stay focused on direct and real help for Canadians, responding to the challenges they're facing with meaningful measures that are going to help millions of Canadians in the middle class and those working hard to join it. If Canadians had followed the advice of the Leader of the Opposition and invested in volatile cryptocurrencies in an attempt to, quote, opt out of inflation, they would have lost half of their savings. Mr. Speaker, responsible leadership means stepping up for Canadians and being there to support them. Will the Conservative leader support our measures to support Canadians?
Well, with that, let's bring in two journalists who are watching that unfold earlier in the week. Heather Scoffield is the Ottawa Bureau Chief and an economics columnist for the Toronto Star. Joanna Smith is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press. Hello to the two of you. So listen, I want to begin here with a bit of the backstory when it comes to Poilievre and Trudeau, because, you know, the House of Commons, of course, a place of debate. It's where politicians are always trying to score points at their opponent's expense. So what made this encounter, really this first time between Poilievre and Trudeau meeting, what made it so buzzworthy for Ottawa? Joanna, I'll ask you to start us off.
I think just first of all, the fact that it was finally happening. Trudeau, of course, was out of the country for the Queen's state funeral for a few days. And so this was really this highly anticipated showdown. Pierre Poilievre has a history of being able to get under politicians' skin. What's one of the reasons he was finance critic facing off against Bill Morneau when he was finance minister for a while. And there was sort of, I think he was noted for his ability to really kind of rile him up. And so this showdown of taking Pierre Poilievre, who has always been a strong performer in the House of Commons, now facing off directly against the Prime Minister, is sort of setting the stage for what's to come. So I think there's a few things that I noticed that may sort of tell the story going forward. One, his opening question began with a semi-personal dig on the fact that Trudeau had been taking a plane, right? And this whole idea of expensive travel. It seemed like a bit of a personal dig. And secondarily, he then, in his next question, went into suggesting that the federal price on carbon is not working because the government has to triple it. Well, tripling it is actually part of the plan. It's not a sign of failure. So that sort of ability to take something that people may not fully understand and score a political point of it is something that I think we're going to see going forward. And then just as importantly, Trudeau's response. He focused on the affordability issue that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are clearly going to be trying to push going forward. And so rather than sort of responding with any personal attack, rather than really get drawn into some clear wedges, we did see a focus on policy from the Prime Minister as well.
You know, Heather, that's interesting listening to Joanna there, because I think there are people that will have watched this and been paying attention to Ottawa's obsession with this encounter, thinking it's nothing more than political theater. But truly, people were looking or trying to find something a bit more tangible out of it as well.
Yeah, for me, it was interesting that they did engage so much on policy. And in fact, I would say earlier on in the week before Justin Trudeau returned from New York, there were some really great exchanges between, for those of us who like policy anyway, there were some great exchanges between Pierre Poilievre and Chrystia Freeland, also around policy. So for me, it's interesting that both of them have zeroed in on affordability and inflation as their key issue, and they're having an excellent debate, eye to eye. I would say that that's what we saw when Pierre Poilievre faced off against Justin Trudeau. I think that there seems to be a recognition that from each other that they're worthy opponents, and that they have kind of defined their battleground here as being around affordability and inflation, which is something that matters a lot to people. So, of course, there's a lot of, around the fringes, there are a lot of personal insults flying there. And I would say underneath, there's a whole cross current there of, the culture wars, which never abate and are not too far from the surface. But, okay, so if we're looking at that theater of question period, we did see some excellent debate between the two on a commonly defined turf, around inflation and affordability. And I think, the Canadian public can take some heart in that and take some information from that too, right? To assess, okay, what's the best way forward here?
And you're right, there was a lot of policy discussed this past week. But, I also do wonder about the relationship between these two leaders, because, Heather, you mentioned a bit of the undercurrent of culture wars. But, Joanna, what about the undercurrent of how each feels about the other?
I think they're both going to need to be on guard for that, frankly. And I think Trudeau risks allowing Poilievre to get under his skin and rile him up. Trudeau has a habit of, when he is feeling a little agitated or perhaps overconfident, of making some off-the-cuff remarks that are seen as inappropriate and can land him in a bit of hot water. That debate months ago over the alleged curse word in the House of Commons, right? So I think there's a potential for him to misstep a little bit there, and I think there's also potential for Poilievre to be very aware of that weakness of the Prime Minister and try to exploit it to his benefit. But at the same time, there's also, I think, a risk for Poilievre as being seen as too over the top. So I think Heather made a really good point that there is this undercurrent, but I think in the House of Commons, they'd probably both be wise to focus a little bit more on policy. And we're hearing these chants from the Conservative backbenches about Poilievre being, for the people, things like that. And so if either of them gets too caught up in their egos or too caught up in this whole idea of them fighting with each other, they risk losing sight of what they're actually doing, which is selling themselves as the best leader for Canadians in the next election.
Heather, what would you say to that? Because I think it is safe to say that there's not a lot of love lost between these two men.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, I was kind of taken, when their very first appearance was, just about 10 days ago or so, when they showed up in the House of Commons for their comments on the Queen, when they shook, they met each other across the aisle there and shook each other's hand and looked each other in the eye and actually smiled at each other. I would love to know what they actually said to each other too. But I mean,
where's a microphone when you need one?
Yeah, exactly. But it just really made me wonder. I thought before I saw that, I thought they really hated each other. Like it was intense. But maybe they can overcome that when the moment calls for it. Maybe, I'm going to reserve judgment on that too, because I do. There is so much animosity, and to Joanna's point, Pierre Poilievre risks being over the top. has made his name as being the attack dog. He's won support by corralling anger. He's a magnet for anger across the country, and there's no doubt that anger is very real. A lot of it is directed at Justin Trudeau, but if he's going to appeal to the broader public, I think he's got to ask himself, and he's being advised to perhaps tone it down, bring it to the center a little bit, as is Justin Trudeau being advised, or being pressured by his caucus, I think, to be a little bit more centrist and a little bit more moderate in their approach. So, it'll be very interesting how they manage to balance those two forces off against each other, because, they make their name and they make their, they catch public attention by differentiating each other, and yet they're getting these pressures to kind of meet in the middle a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, listen, that is part one of our discussion. Thank you to the two of you for that. But stand by, both Joanna and Heather, because we are going to come back to you in a moment. But right now, I do want to talk about Ottawa's response to the economic struggles being felt by Canadians across the country, as we heard from both Heather and Joanna. Now, Conservatives continue to hammer the government on its response to the issue. But listen right now to opposition MP Michael Barrett, followed by the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland.
The number one way that this Prime Minister and his coalition partners could help Canadians, give them real relief, is by committing to not raise taxes and committing to not introduce any new taxes. We have payroll taxes that are going up on January 1st. The carbon tax continues to go up. We have a situation across this country where furnaces are going to be clicking on this week and next, and people are going to be making even tougher choices about what they can put in their grocery.
What we are seeing right now is a very clear contrast between what a Liberal government believes is the right thing for Canadians and what we're hearing the Conservatives say. Our government understands we need a plan for jobs and growth. We have that. And we actually have an economy today whose fundamentals are strong. We believe we need a fiscally responsible approach. We have that too. And we absolutely understand that a lot of Canadians are struggling today with the cost of living.
Now, the Liberals did introduce their affordability package this past week. It includes a temporary doubling of the GST rebate, rent support, and the dental care program the Liberals promised in their deal with the NDP. But how do people struggling economically feel about the federal government's efforts? Leigh Bursey is an anti-poverty activist, a former city councillor in Brockville, Ontario, and someone who knows firsthand what it means to be economically insecure. I spoke to him earlier this week in Mount Pearl, Newfoundland. Leigh, thank you for being with us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's quite an honor.
Listen, we're going to get to your assessment of the Liberal affordability package, but if you don't mind, I do want to ask you to share your own personal story, because in addition to working on poverty issues, based on your own personal experience, you know firsthand how it is to struggle with housing and income insecurity.
Absolutely. So right now I'm a 35-year-old newlywed homeowner in Mount Pearl, and I'm very grateful to be in that position, recognizing how many people that is a very elusive dream for. But that wasn't always the case. There was a time when my mother and I, based on some unfortunate domestic situations in my youth, ended up homeless in a tent. Then, of course, I was a municipal councillor, and even during those periods, we were definitely generationally and secretly poor. And understanding that meant that we depended on family as much as we could, wherever that was possible, and the kindness of great mentors and strangers. And eventually turned that into an opportunity where I could better serve the community myself by doing something meaningful. And now I'm on the board for the Canadian Housing Renewal Association and the Canadian Alliance to End Rural Remote Homelessness, National Alliance rather, and a variety of other organizations of that nature, chartered housing professionals. And now I'm doing street outreach.
And as you say, working on something that is very meaningful to you. And as we talk about the income insecurity that Canadians are feeling right now, we know that based on polling, the vast majority of Canadians say that they are struggling with the current cost of living. So what has inflation done to those who have less means? What have you seen firsthand? What have you heard?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of people have their own preconceived notions as to why people end up poor and what some of those challenges might look like. And the fact is that while there's no doubt there's a segment of the population who may be struggling with a variety of mental health challenges or maybe addiction issues, or maybe there may have been some involvement in other means that led to that destination. The fact is that you have a lot of people who are very much struggling and are working full-time. In a service-based economy where the cost of living continues to increase, but the wages continue to stagnate. And even with some of the increases we've seen on minimum wages across the province and across the country, rather, that doesn't necessarily equate a better quality of life for people who are now feeling that pinch in other places. And we've seen that in the post-COVID-19 recovery, probably on a more astronomical, straightforward level than we had previously, where things used to etch up and sort of crawl towards something more unaffordable. Right now, we are absolutely seeing the pinch of inflation.
Mm-hmm. So when the federal government proposes GST rebates, doubling them for 6 months, dental care, rental support, what do you make of that kind of proposal?
I think that this is wonderful, and no doubt I would be the first one to champion any opportunity that we have to put money back in people's pockets, especially those who are vulnerable or struggling. We have a lot of people who are not getting their gas subsidized from where they work, who are feeling the pinch at the tanks, in spite of the fact that that's a progressive policy and probably with a well-intentioned result. But we know that public transportation is costing more than it did at one point. So any opportunity to assist people, especially when we're talking about either first those who are struggling against rising rents in the private sector, and a variety of different circumstances that may make life more unaffordable than it did before, that's great. But I would caution that each and every one of the proposals I've seen has some temporary mandate attached to it. This is not a carte blanche check that's going to be there ongoing for any period of time, other than a short-term stimulus to help people get over the hump. And if it does, no doubt more money in people's pockets when they're struggling as it is, especially heading into the notorious Canadian winters that we're used to, is probably a very positive thing with definitely a well-intentioned outcome. Mm-hmm. The challenge, of course, is what does that turn into?
Yeah, I'm quickly running out of time, but I do want to ask you, because as you say, well-intentioned outcome perhaps, but there is some concern about these programs, that bringing them in may actually just raise inflation even further rather than bring it down. What do you say to that?
I think that there's always that possibility, although mathematically we know that when you raise the minimum wage, as an example, that means more people spending money in their economy. Microeconomics is still economics. The idea here is if we're willing to subsidize small businesses who were hit during COVID with debt recovery, how come we're not doing the same for those who are struggling, such as residential renters, who of course are the reason if we're able to keep people housed, we're also able to keep those units deeply affordable and avoid unnecessary increases. The fact is that any initiative that's put in place that helps people maintain a quality of life, especially in uncertain times, is a positive one, and we definitely did trumpet it. But the challenge is that there are unknown variables, and greed is a reality in economics.
Leigh Bursey, really good to speak with you today. Thank you for the time.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Let's bring back Heather Scoffield from the Toronto Star and Joanna Smith from the Canadian Press. Heather, I'm going to ask you to start us off here. I think it is easy, and we have been saying that many Canadians are feeling economic pain right now. But the affordability package that the Liberals introduced this past week is much more targeted than, say, perhaps a broad-based tax cut. What's the government trying to achieve here?
What they're really aiming for is to not make inflation worse, but make affordability better. And, there's a fine line between the two. They are related. The more prices go up, obviously, the less affordable things become. But affordability is kind of, this underlying problem that we've had in society. And then we get rising prices on top of it, which make that problem even worse. So if they're trying to help affordability, they're trying to help households make ends meet. What they're trying to do here is very narrowly target what they're putting forward in legislation and in funding to hit those households that are really having trouble, and not, push a whole bunch of billions of dollars out the door to everybody that would, inflate or possibly make inflation push the prices up even higher because people are just going to go shopping with their money. So we see, they've got the three elements. They've got in one bill, they've got a top up to the housing benefit, which goes to very low income renters. And And in there, they've also got the dental money, which will go to families making less than $90,000 with kids under 12. And that's in response to the deal that they have with the NDP to keep them in power. And then the separate legislation is to double the GST credit for low and middle income families for 6 months. So that's going forward separately. And, they do kind of keep saying that this is not going to everybody. It's going to, the people who need it the most. It's, about $3 billion in extra new money added to the fiscal framework here. So it's not nothing, that's for sure. And there's an open debate about whether or not this is going to be inflationary or if it's just, the compassionate thing to do to help people get through some rough times here.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, we're seeing that pushback from Pierre Poilievre, which I'll get to in a moment. But, Joanna, I do want to talk about the Conservative leader in a different light, because Poilievre has been talking about the economic stress people are feeling right now, talking about the jump in prices for things like food and gas. And it seems that message is getting traction. How worrying is that for both Liberals and New Democrats?
I think we're seeing the fact that the Liberals acknowledge that is getting traction in the fact that this affordability plan has been tabled to begin with. I remember months ago when Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland was asked about rising gas prices, and she made a comment that I think many perceived to be quite awkward about how rising gas prices may end up helping out with climate change action. And I understand what she was saying in the sense that it's almost like an accidental price on carbon and would act as a disincentive for people using their cars more. But I think it was really seen to be quite appropriately out of touch, right? That we're talking about people who are really struggling to make ends meet, and now is maybe not the time to say, oh well, the fact that your gas costs so much more is going to be good for the climate. I think this plan, it was originally supposed to be announced, of course, on September 8th, and that was put on hold with the death of the monarch. So this idea that it was announced then, shortly after Poilievre winning and seen as a response to him winning, it was planned ahead of time, but I think it was pretty evident that Poilievre would win and that he would likely be placing such a strong emphasis on affordability. So I think that the fact they're doing it to begin with and moving away from this idea that these extra spending would be inflationary, and Heather makes a good point. It's a fine balance to strike. You want to target it carefully at people who are struggling to pay the bills, but not at people who, at the meantime, you want to be cooling the housing market and not contributing to higher costs all around, given people spending more of that money. One thing I really found interesting this week was that Michael Barrett came out and said, and really suggested the Conservatives are going to, in fact, be supporting the doubling of the GST credit. I thought that was interesting because I think many people sort of assumed that with the victory of Pierre Poilievre that he may be taking a scorched earth policy to the Liberals and any opponent, really, and that he would go in sort of refusing to support and cooperate in any way. So the fact that the Conservatives are responding, suggesting that they are, not going to be supporting dental care because they don't believe that that's the right approach, but they are open to supporting the doubling of GST credits, suggests to me that they know that getting in the way and demanding an all or nothing approach, that lower taxes across the board or we won't cooperate at all, may also not resonate with Canadians, and perhaps that these criticisms that they've been obstructive may resonate a bit more. So I think that's interesting that we are perhaps likely to see some cooperation on that front.
Yeah, and something that we'll be watching out for. But Heather, what's also interesting here is I talked earlier about Poilievre's pushback to the affordability plan put out by the Prime Minister. From the Conservative leader, he's not talking about income supports. Instead, he's talking about payroll taxes, carbon pricing. How does that attract support, or are some people just looking for different economic leadership altogether?
I think it certainly attracts attention because, this has been a perennial approach by the Conservative Party to talk about what they've done is put everything in the tax basket, right? By talking about we need lower taxes, it gets automatic support from many, many Conservatives and probably a lot of people who are not Conservative as well, who just don't like paying taxes, right? So it's a sure winner in that respect. And so, it's incumbent on the Liberals, I think, and they to dissect that and show exactly what it would mean to not increase EI premiums, to not increase CPP premiums, and to, back away on the carbon tax. So it kind of puts them on the defensive. And, that we did see Liberals trying to explain themselves this week, trying to explain, okay, if we don't do this with EI premiums, this is what would happen. If we don't do this with CPP premiums, this is what would happen. So it's a pretty good effective technique from the Conservatives, and certainly gets a lot of attention. It just kind of breaks down a little bit when you get into the details of it all. It's interesting they've used that same tax argument, just to go back to Joanna's point there about how interesting it is that they are indicating that they will support the doubling of the GST tax credit. That's not a tax cut either. It's a tax credit, and it's temporary. But because they've used that tax cut argument to be able to justify supporting the doubling of the tax credit, which is a kind of a convenient, I'd say, vehicle to show that they are on side with this. But I mean, they have to. I guess that's how that's the tool that they're using to make themselves a little bit more consistent, I would say, in their arguments.
Okay. Again, we are watching that one as well. Listen, Heather, Joanna, thank you for. We're going to get back to you in a little bit later in the program, but our thanks right now to Heather Scoffield and Joanna Smith.
ArriveCAN is a critical tool to process travelers with the requirement of the vaccine mandate. So we're asking, it's a tool that helps process arrivals as they arrive.
So you want to keep it mandatory beyond September 30th?
There's no decision has been made. We are, as we've said all along,
final decision's been made.
We're constantly assessing the situation and making decisions based on the information.
So you think it should remain beyond September 30th?
I'm not sure what's changed in their in the epidemiological evaluation of risk to Canadians that's happening on September 30th that hasn't happened today. So we know it's hurting our small businesses, border communities, tourism sector, all the days in between and all the days preceding that they weren't aligned with their provincial counterparts in their risk assessment.
You just heard some of the policy and the politics around the ArriveCAN app, but with reports suggesting the federal government will soon end some of its COVID-19 border measures, what about the science? Is it safe to end the mandatory use of ArriveCAN? Is it safe to drop vaccine requirements for international travelers entering Canada? To talk about all of that, I did speak earlier this week with Dr. Isaac Bogoch, an infectious diseases scientist and specialist. Isaac, so good to see you. Thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. Great to see you as well, Michael.
Listen, I want to begin with your reaction here because as you heard, and really as you know, there is pressure to drop this app. Is this a risky move in any way?
I really don't think it is. I think a lot of these policies, especially related to travel, certainly many of them had their place and time earlier on in the pandemic. But I think it's also fair to acknowledge we're in a much different place right now. And I think the sun is setting on several of these policies, including the ArriveCAN app. I think we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we're trying to do with this? What is the goal? Is this to keep COVID out of Canada? Because we have plenty of COVID in Canada, unfortunately. I just don't think the app right now is really achieving what its intended purposes are, and that's okay. It just means you have to lift that policy and move along.
Okay, move along, but it's not just the ArriveCAN app, it seems, because it seems that the app itself is just one component. As reports have it, though, we're also going to be looking at the end of randomized testing on arrivals. That's going to go. So what do you make of that?
I think the randomized testing, just calling it how it is, it doesn't sound like it's been implemented as smoothly as it could have been. People get tested, and we've heard many reports of people having to find testing sites that are distant from the airport. It was very cumbersome, and it just doesn't really achieve the stated goals as well. There are pilot projects that are running in Toronto and looking like they're going to expand elsewhere, where they're going to do wastewater surveillance for incoming aircrafts and airports. And again, that's a less expensive way to answer the exact same questions. You can really track variants of concern that are emerging and that are entering the country. And that's just a very helpful way to address that issue without inconveniencing travelers.
Okay, and I'm going to pick up on a point that you said, if it's no longer working, move on. So were these measures really to try and control border entry, were they ever useful? Because really in the early days of the pandemic, as you know, the government was hesitant to bring in any kind of border measure. And as the pandemic evolved, as the public outcry grew louder, it was then the Arrive Can app and other measures that came about. So were they ever useful?
It's hard to say, and I think we need to study this, and we need to actually critically evaluate this. But it's pretty clear that earlier on in the pandemic, when we were dealing with the ancestral strain that emerged from Wuhan, or the Alpha variant, and even to some extent the Delta variant, 2 doses of a vaccine would very significantly reduce one's risk of getting the infection and transmitting the infection to others. Now, a lot of that, unfortunately, has been lost in the Omicron era. I'd still say that the vaccine does a remarkable job in protecting people against severe infection, but it just doesn't do the same degree as it once did in terms of protecting us against getting the infection and transmitting the infection. So these policies could have at least slowed down some of the spread of COVID, not stop it, but maybe slow it down a little bit, because 2 doses of the vaccine would certainly have prevented incoming travelers from bringing COVID in at that time. It would certainly reduce it significantly. But the Omicron era really changed so many things. We know it's very transmissible. We know 2 doses of a vaccine does very little in terms of protecting us against getting the infection and transmitting to others. And when the virus changes and the science evolves, it's time to update the policy.
Okay, but the pandemic is not over. So when you talk about updating the policy, what is appropriate now? Because as you say, in the age of Omicron, getting it, spreading it, still possible with 2 doses, but it still, prevents the worst of the disease. But what is appropriate right now, given that the pandemic's not over?
I think the appropriate thing to do is really to ensure that vulnerable individuals and at-risk communities get access to the vaccine. There are people that are certainly under-vaccinated that would greatly benefit from a booster vaccine, and we're just not seeing the same degree of uptake in those populations as we should be. We know who lands in hospital. We know who gets sick. We know who succumbs to this illness. It is an older population, namely people over the age of 60, not exclusively, but that group is overrepresented in hospital and sadly overrepresented in those who succumb to this illness. We also know people with underlying medical conditions that put them at greater risk for severe infection are overrepresented in hospital, and we have to do targeted outreach. I think that would go a long way in protecting individuals, protecting communities, and also alleviating a lot of pressure from the healthcare system. What do I mean by targeted outreach? I think people can recall back to when 1st and 2nd doses were going into arms. We had vaccine centers that were in community centers. We had vaccine clinics in houses of worship. We had door-to-door vaccination programs. We had vaccination programs at places of work. We had 24-hour vaccine clinics to accommodate people that work in different schedules. And we really were taking the vaccine and bringing it to the people rather than bringing people to the vaccine. I think approaches like that, especially for vulnerable communities and individuals, would go a long way. So, and yes or no on this very quickly. So what you say is focus on building up defenses at home rather than worry about who's actually coming into the country. I think that's appropriate at this point in time. Isaac, always good to speak with you. Thank you for this. My pleasure. Have a great day. You too. So that's the science. Let's get back to the politics right now and bring back Heather Scoffield of the Toronto Star and Joanna Smith of the Canadian Press. Okay, Joanna, I'm going to get you to start us off this time because it seems this is the worst kept secret in Ottawa right now, but I think we have to ask, is it safe to say that some travel measures are about to drop?
According to our sources, yes, it's safe to say that the Prime Minister has signed off on allowing a cabinet order that was set to expire on September 30th expire. So that means that foreign nationals visiting Canada will no longer be required to be fully vaccinated. There'll be an end to testing and quarantine of international travelers as well. And this will also spell the end of the mandatory part of filling out the Arrive Can app with vaccinations. So that has been decided, that in fact didn't even need to go to cabinet because it was just a matter of allowing an order to expire. And so we're expecting an official announcement at some point, but at this point that almost feels unnecessary because you're right, this is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a sieve if you're trying to keep a secret because there have been all these leaks. Heather, what's your take on all of this?
It's interesting. The timing is interesting because, the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, is now claiming victory, and he's out there. It's a bit of mischief making because, as Joanna said, this was about to expire anyway, so they had to decide one way or another. But the Pierre Poilievre is out there saying that it's, that he's only just begun in terms of scoring victories and points, pushing the Liberals into measures that work with his agenda. So, it's a reminder that that the border restrictions and requirements have become so politicized, and even from day one they've been politicized, and it's been very difficult politically for the Liberals to find a way through this. They still have to decide what's going to happen with masks, and I'm not sure where they're heading on that. If they are going to still require masks for international travel, domestic travel, it's not quite as political as the ArriveCan app and as the quarantine requirements and so forth, but it still is pretty contentious.
Okay, but Heather, but as you say that, though, I think it is also worthwhile to ask whether or not this is the government following the science and letting the order expire and not renew it, or are they bowing to pressure? Because beyond the Conservatives, there's also industry pressure to drop these requirements.
Yeah, there is a lot of pressure, that's for sure. And we see the industry groups and travel groups constantly, border mayors along the border and so forth, really being quite relentless in how much pressure they're putting on the federal government to do this. And, we saw Joe Biden announced this week that the pandemic was essentially over in the United States, and now taking a lot of backlash for that too, because the science would say that it's not exactly over. It's still here with us, and so they are balancing politics. Both Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau are balancing politics here against what's actually happening in people's households in terms of catching COVID. There is the World Health Organization has said that it's that the end is in sight. So they can cling to that, I think, as some kind of scientific or at least health advice that they're moving in lockstep with that. But in sight, I think a lot of people would say, a lot of people who are worried about COVID would say having the end in sight is not exactly the same as having the end right here in our faces. Mm-hmm.
And without a doubt, there's still people worried about a decision either way. But Joanna, running out of time, but I want to quickly ask you, because if this is, and we know it is, have an underlying of a political undercurrent, will the Liberals take a political hit on their border policies for either letting the order expire or having it in place for as long as they did?
I think part of the calculation here is also moving with the U.S. So now U.S. President Joe Biden is under some pressure from lawmakers to relieve those measures at the northern border. Because remember, Canada was not acting entirely alone there, so they also have that on their side. And I think the Liberals had staked themselves so clearly on listen to science, we are following the science, that had they lifted these measures earlier, potentially they would have conversely been seen as performing a bit of a flip-flop, right? I mean, if they were sort of just moving with everyone's mood rather than what they were being told by public health officials. So I think it makes sense they're allowing it to expire. I also, as Heather said, I don't think we're going to be seeing Justin Trudeau coming out and saying the pandemic is over. That I think would be seen as a flip-flop too, that he's not going to wanting to make some big pronouncement. Because you never know what can happen. I think, remember last summer, Jason Kenney in Alberta and his best summer ever. I think that was quite instructive for everyone when it all fell apart in the fall. So I do think they are perhaps more worried about doing things prematurely, because once you lift measures, it's really hard to bring them back. And by this point, there was really still so little left within federal jurisdiction in terms of their control over things, mask mandates, vaccine mandates provincially, even federally in terms of the federal workforce have been lifted for some time now. So this is sort of the last key thing. And so I think there was some nervousness about doing it prematurely and being unable to walk it back.
Okay. Well, thank you once again, Joanna and Heather, but stand by. We have one more segment ahead. So for now, our thanks, and we'll be back to you in a moment.
A lot of progress has been made on the implementation of the Cannabis Act and its dual objectives of protecting public health and maintaining public safety. We need to assess the work that has been done and learn how and where to adjust where needed to meet these goals.
It will also consider impacts on Indigenous peoples, racialized communities, and women who might be at greater risk of harm or face greater barriers to participation in the legal industry based on identity or socioeconomic factors.
As this review gets underway, there is another issue top of mind for many, and that has to do with Canadians who, before legalization, were convicted for simple possession. Now, that crime no longer exists when it comes to cannabis, but many lives are still affected by earlier convictions. So, to talk about that, we did reach out earlier to Annamaria Enenajor. She is the founder and the executive director of the nonprofit group Cannabis Amnesty. Annamaria, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Michael.
So as we talk about this review, one aspect that will be examined is past criminalizations. How do you react to that news that they are going to go back and review what has gone right and what has gone wrong?
Well, it's a hopeful development, but I do note that this government has made strides to examine the impact that past criminalizations have had on individuals, but have done so in a piecemeal fashion in the past. So a year following legalization, Bill C-93 was passed, which provided for expedited and a waiver of the application fee for individuals who want to apply for a pardon. And more recently, there is an amendment to a bill that's before the Senate currently, Bill C-5, that purports to create an automatic suspension or expungement for individuals who have previous cannabis simple possession records, as well as other simple possession of illicit substance records. And so the government has been inching towards looking at this, but have done so in a very piecemeal and sort of long form fashion, and haven't taken it on in a systematic review.
Let's go back a little bit, though, because as you say, there have been some moves here, and one of it has to do with suspending these convictions. Why would that not be enough?
Well, suspending these convictions means that there is a possibility that they could be reinstated in the future, which is really concerning to a lot of Canadians. But I think more practically, the issue is that a suspension is what we would colloquially call a pardon. And a lot of the primary reason why a lot of people get these pardons is and suspensions is because for employment, but a secondary and very important reason is because they would like to travel to the United States. And the United States does not, in fact, recognize Canadian pardons or suspensions, so it would be of no benefit to them to get a suspension. So if we look at why suspensions aren't enough, the primary reason is because it doesn't actually offer a person relief from the hardship that comes from having a criminal record that they hoped they would get.
Let's talk a bit more about that. And to be clear, just for people at home, to reiterate, what we're discussing here are past convictions for simple possession, nothing more. But you've spoken in the past about how having this on a record will have an impact on one's life. You mentioned crossing into the United States. You talk about employment. But it goes beyond that as well, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And there are some ways in which it appears in people's lives that are surprising and disturbing. For a number of people, it can come up even when applying for housing. So there are a number of municipalities, including Ottawa, that employ a multi-housing safety initiative where is a background check that is required in order to qualify for certain types of housing. And there are other things that also appear to stifle a person's ability to move on with their life, such as it previous conviction for cannabis possession, preventing them from obtaining loans, either for school or for a business. And if you're trying to rehabilitate somebody who has a previous criminal conviction, but there are these roadblocks in the way, it is quite difficult to find an argument for why there's a reason for this to persist. Also, if you would like to volunteer for vulnerable sectors, this kind of conviction can come up in a vulnerable sectors check. But it's quite surprising. I know somebody who wanted to apply for a loan for post-secondary education, wasn't able to obtain one because of a cannabis conviction.
So very life-limiting. You know, I'm quickly running out of time, but we also need to point out then part of the reason why you're doing this too is because there is a racial component that you're trying to raise with these convictions as well.
Yes, absolutely. It's despite the fact that cannabis is widely consumed in Canada. We have one of the highest rates of cannabis consumption in the world. People are not being facing the same consequences for their actions across the board. Despite widespread consumptions, you have disproportionate overrepresentation of low-income, Indigenous, and Black Canadians in the numbers of people who are stopped, searched, arrested, prosecuted, and ultimately incarcerated for cannabis possession offenses. And this is evident in large metropolitan areas all over the country. But for example, in Vancouver, you are 7 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession if you're Indigenous than if you're white. And so that, I think, adds another layer of unfairness and injustice to this situation.
And another point to review as this gets underway. Annamaria, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much.
Well, as we wrap up this edition of Primetime Politics Weekend, let's bring back one final time Joanna Smith of the Canadian Press and Heather Scoffield from the Toronto Star. So week 1 down of Parliament's return. Now, we began the program today talking about Poilievre and Trudeau's first meeting in the House as leaders of their party. Now that that's done, what will you be looking for in the week ahead in terms of dynamics at the very least? Heather, start us off.
Yeah, I'll be looking to see if they continue on this path of actually discussing and having, solid debates back and forth about what to do about inflation and affordability. The Prime Minister is actually not going to be there in the House again at the beginning of this week because of international travel. He's going to Japan to attend the funeral of Shinzo Abe. So, it's an opportunity, I would say, for the cabinet ministers to engage like they did earlier this week on policy and dig down into the legislation that's before them. I think the Conservatives are going to have to, they've carefully plotted out the first week of how they handle things. Getting into the second week, will they lapse into, catcalling and calling each other's names, or will they continue on to really focus like a laser on affordability issues? That's what I'm looking for. I guess it'll heat up again when we get towards the end of the week and the Prime Minister returns.
Joanna?
I'm looking to see Poilievre announcing his critics, his shadow cabinet. That'll give us a sense of where the party is going to be heading in tone and substance going forward. I'm also looking to see where the NDP comes in on this bill on the dental care. It is not quite what they wanted in the deal. They have sort of talked about this being a first step. They did have to find a way to make sure it actually happened by the deadline, but in a way that was workable. So I think they potentially risk being a little bit lost in this battle between the Liberals and the Conservatives. Or I think we're going to see them pushing to remind people that they had also been asking for the doubling of the GST, for example. So that's another thing to look out for. And I think just looking ahead, to September 30th, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, I'm expecting to see some more questions about promises made, promises broken. We're now in the year after the location by ground penetrating radar of the unmarked graves out west. And so I think there'll be a focus on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as that is on the agenda for the week ahead, we'll also obviously be watching for some more reaction to the appointment of a new Canadian ambassador to China. That was made official Friday morning. It does make me wonder, though, Heather, about Canada's China policy. With a new ambassador, after the drama of the two Michaels, will we now see a change in direction?
Well, Jennifer May spoke to my colleague Tonda McCharles earlier this week and talked about how she was going to handle that. She said she will continue along the lines of her predecessors, I think, in terms of speaking out about human rights issues in China. And, I guess what we've all been waiting for is a big announcement or rolling out of a new China policy in the wake of the release of the two Michaels. And she's kind of indicated that that's not going to happen. It's not going to be a great big unveiling of a new approach here that, that she will plod along. It's interesting. Her appointment is not a political appointment. She comes from the diplomatic corps, and so that she's got to walk a line there too, where she is able to communicate that to whoever she's meeting on the Chinese side that she does have respect in the ear of the Prime Minister back home, but is not going to be playing some giant political game, right? So she's kind of walking between those, and so it sounds to me, just judging from her initial comments, that she will be, muddling through instead of having a great big unveiling of a new approach to China.
Mm-hmm. Joanna, what's your read of it?
Yeah, I agree. I think the choice of a longtime diplomat, like a true diplomat who has spent, 30 some years in the public service and the foreign service, was a choice that sends a signal. It's not a flashy appointment. It's not Dominic Barton. It's not John McCallum. And so I think does signal that a slightly different direction in that approach, and then someone who really, really deeply understands the file and where the government wants to go with things. I think we're all still maybe not anticipating a big new Canada-China policy writ large, but we are anticipating at some point rolling out of the Indo-Pacific strategy, the choice of the term Indo-Pacific rather than Canada-China. People have noticed, right? They're looking for more of a regional approach that acknowledges some other big players in the region. As Heather mentioned, Trudeau will be heading to Japan for the funeral of Abe, but while he's there, we're anticipating some bilateral talks as well, and so potentially some things to look out for on that whole regional file.
Okay, so we now have about a minute left, 30 seconds left to each of you. Anything else that you'll be watching out for, Heather?
I'm just to pick up on Joanna here. I am actually pretty interested in what Justin Trudeau's meetings lead to in terms of, Japan is leading the G7 and for the upcoming meetings, and they've got a lot of things to figure out. All of the G7 countries are grappling with inflation. They're all moving at the same time. Can they coordinate that a little bit and so that they don't overdo it? How will they be dealing with Russia and Ukraine, and the fact that China and India seem to be kind of adjusting their positions towards Vladimir Putin? And so how does G7 play into that, and how does Justin Trudeau's meeting with the Japanese leader play into that as well? I'll be certainly watching that.
Mm-hmm. Joanna, anything else for you?
I'll be watching for more in Ukraine. Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly has said that she's going to be making a national address heavily focused on support for Ukraine early in the week. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any more tangible promises there. We did see Zelensky at the General Assembly ask for more military aid, specifically ammunition. Trudeau highlighted that when asked about it by reporters in New York. So I think we're all waiting for what exactly that will mean. Freeland has talked about the mobilization of more troops by Putin as a turning point in the war, and it'll be interesting to see whether Canada matches that turning point and contributes something new and effective.
Okay. Really great to have both of you on this weekend. Really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And that is Heather Scoffield, who is the Ottawa Bureau Chief and an economics columnist for the Toronto Star. And along with her today was Joanna Smith, Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press. And that is all for this edition of Primetime Politics Weekend. I'm Michael Serapio. From all of us here at CPAC, thanks for watching.